What does it feel like to be dismissed so often that silence becomes your refuge? To speak up, only to have your words shrink into whispers, unheard or worse, mocked? I've lived that reality for years, inside the very place that should have been my sanctuary, my own home. Every time I tried to explain that something felt wrong, my concerns were swept aside like dust on a shelf. They told me I was overreacting, that I was too sensitive, that maybe I was imagining things. It was a slow unraveling, a quiet erosion of my voice and my sense of self. The rooms around me were filled with laughter, chatter, and noise, but my words seemed to vanish into thin air. I learned quickly that raising an alarm wasn't safe or welcome. Instead, I learned to fold myself smaller, to swallow the knot of discomfort tightening in my chest. I became an expert at nodding along, at pretending I understood when I didn't, at pretending the unease was mine alone to carry. The more I tried to speak, the louder the silence grew in response. It wasn't just the words that were dismissed. It was my feelings, my intuition, my very perception of reality. That dismissal was like a weight pressing down so hard it left no room for doubt or question. I began to question myself. Was I too emotional? Was I reading too much into things? Was my sense of safety just misplaced? But deep inside, something didn't add up. I felt a persistent, gnawing unease, a truth I couldn't shake. I tried to explain it in the simplest ways, hoping my voice would reach someone's heart. But it was always met with a shrug, a laugh, or a quick change of subject. I became invisible in the conversations that surrounded me. My experiences were minimized, my fears reduced to faint echoes. I wasn't just unheard, I was unseen. The very people I should have been able to trust made me feel like I was the problem, the troublemaker, the one who stirred storms in calm seas. Living like that, inside those walls, is a strange kind of loneliness. It's not the solitude that comes from being alone, but the isolation of being surrounded by people who refuse to acknowledge your reality. It's a quiet kind of pain that doesn't scream or shout, but seeps into every corner of your mind, dulling your spirit. I carried that pain in silence for so long that it almost became a part of me, a shadow I couldn't escape. Yet, beneath all that silence, beneath the layers of dismissal and doubt, I held onto a flicker of something stubborn and unyielding, an unspoken truth that I was never wrong to feel what I felt. That flicker was fragile, but it was there, waiting for a moment when it could finally breathe. And then, on one ordinary night, something shifted. Without fanfare or confrontation, a single moment quietly peeled back the layers of years spent being unseen and unheard. In that stillness, the truth I had carried alone was finally exposed, not with anger or accusation, but with a clarity that changed everything I thought I knew. That night didn't come with warning or drama. It simply arrived, like a breath held too long being released, and suddenly, everything made sense. I know this story might sound familiar to anyone who's spent years feeling dismissed or invisible, whose words were brushed aside or twisted until they doubted their own truth. It's not just a story about a single night. It's about the quiet weight of being unheard for so long that the silence becomes almost unbearable. If you've ever carried that kind of loneliness, that sense that no one really saw you, or that your experience was too complicated or too painful to put into words, then this moment resonates in ways you might never have had the space to explore before. It's strange how the most profound shifts can come not with fireworks or loud reckonings, but in these soft, almost imperceptible changes, those subtle unmaskings of truth that ripple beneath the surface until you can't ignore them anymore. Staying with this story means sitting with those moments that often go unspoken, the ones that don't fit neatly into explanations or easy resolutions. It's a kind of shared quiet, a place where feelings that have been pushed aside finally find recognition. This space, the one we're in together now, holds those stories, the ones that rarely get told with the honesty and care they deserve. Here, there's room to acknowledge the pain without rushing to fix it, room to see the smaller moments where everything shifts, even if they don't come wrapped in drama. If you find yourself lingering here, it's because somewhere deep down, these stories are part of your own experience too, even if you never had the words to say it out loud before. And maybe, in this shared space, those words can start to take shape. It wasn't just that my feelings were brushed aside. It was how quietly it happened, like a slow leak rather than a sudden rupture. I remember trying to share little things, hoping for acknowledgement, and instead being met with a kind of invisible shrug. Like the time I told my mom I felt left out at school. I said, "I don't know. It's like no one really notices me." She glanced up from her phone, barely pausing. "You're just being dramatic," she said, voice light, almost teasing. "Everyone feels that way sometimes." I wanted to argue, to explain how this wasn't just sometimes, but a steady ache. Instead, I just nodded, because who wants to be the kid who can't handle normal feelings? At dinner, the table buzzed with chatter, but when I tried to say something about how I was feeling invisible even in my own family, my dad cut in with a joke about me being a little ghost. Laughter followed, but I felt smaller, like I'd just been reduced to a punchline. I remember staring down at my plate, the warmth of the food doing nothing to ease the cold tightening in my chest. I wanted to say, "I'm here," but the words seemed to dissolve before they could reach my mouth. Over time, these moments piled up, one on top of the other, until I started questioning what I even felt. If my own family could laugh at my pain or dismiss it as nonsense, maybe I was just making it up. Maybe I was too sensitive. Once, when I told my older sister I felt anxious about an upcoming test, she shrugged and said, "Stop worrying. You're fine. You always blow things out of proportion." It wasn't mean exactly, but it was definitive, a line in the sand drawn between her experience and mine. Her certainty made me doubt my own. Was I really overreacting? I remember sitting in my room one evening, replaying these conversations in my head. The way my words were met with chuckles, averted eyes, or quick dismissals. It was like I was speaking a different language from everyone else. Not because I was strange, but because my feelings seemed to belong somewhere else, somewhere no one really wanted to go. I thought, maybe if I just keep quiet, maybe if I don't make a fuss, things will be easier. But that silence didn't bring peace. It just made the loneliness grow. Even when I tried to explain the slow, creeping hurt, the way it wasn't just one thing but a series of small cuts, I was met with impatience. "Why do you always have to make everything so complicated?" my mom asked once, folding laundry while I spoke. "You're fine. You don't need to make a big deal out of it." Her words weren't cruel, but they were firm and final, leaving no room for more. I wanted to say, "But I don't feel fine." Yet I swallowed the words because I'd learned that trying to explain only made me sound weaker. There was this constant, subtle undercurrent of being sidelined, like I was present in form but absent in feeling. My attempts to connect felt like echoes in a vast, empty room. I started to wonder if my emotions were valid at all. If they were real, why did they seem so unimportant to the people who mattered most? The more I doubted myself, the quieter I became, retreating into a shell that felt safer than the risk of being ignored or laughed at again. One afternoon, I remember telling my dad, "Sometimes, I just feel like I don't matter." He looked at me, surprised, and shrugged. "That's nonsense. You're part of this family. You matter." But his tone was casual, almost dismissive, like it was a phrase said out of habit, not conviction. I wanted to believe him, but my heart heard something else. A hollow space where my feelings should have been met with care. It was a small moment, but it chipped away at my sense of belonging, just a little more. This pattern became so familiar that I barely noticed it happening anymore. It wasn't loud or dramatic. There were no big fights or shouting matches, just a quiet erosion, a slow fading of my voice into the background. The moments when I tried to speak up became fewer and farther between, like I was learning not to expect much from those around me. And in that silence, the doubt grew, weaving itself into the fabric of how I saw myself. Sometimes, late at night, I'd wonder if maybe I was imagining it all, that maybe my feelings were just shadows cast by my own insecurities. But deep down, I knew the truth was quieter, more painful, that my pain was real, but it simply didn't fit where I was. It didn't fit under the same roof, at the same table, in the same conversations. And slowly, without anyone noticing, that made me feel more invisible than ever. At first, I thought maybe it was just me being too sensitive or overthinking things. But as the days and years passed, I noticed how the people around me never seemed to question their own behavior or why I kept slipping into the background. It wasn't like anyone was openly cruel or mean. In fact, most of them seemed perfectly kind, even caring in their own way. What I began to realize was that there was a kind of invisible safeguard protecting them from any scrutiny, a wall built from routines, authority, and the simple, unquestioned idea that that's just how things are. It was a pattern so deeply woven into the fabric of everyday life that no one stopped to wonder if it might be wrong, or hurtful, or even unfair. When I tried to speak up, to explain how I felt, the responses were often the same. A quick smile, a dismissive laugh, or a change of subject. It wasn't that they meant to ignore me. They simply didn't see the weight behind my words. The routines of daily life, the flow of conversations, the unspoken rules about who speaks and who listens, all combined to keep things exactly as they were. I remember one evening when I was younger, trying to tell my dad that I felt invisible at the dinner table. "It's not that you're invisible," he said with a chuckle. "You're just quiet sometimes. You don't have to make everything about you." It sounded so harmless, but it shut down what I was trying to say before I could even finish. This kind of response wasn't limited to my parents. Even my siblings, who I thought might understand me better, often brushed off my feelings without meaning to. "Come on, you're making a big deal out of nothing," my sister once told me after I tried to explain how alone I felt in the family group chat. The words were soft, but the message was clear. My feelings were not something worth dwelling on. Over time, these small moments piled up, creating a quiet barrier between my truth and their comfort. The more this pattern repeated, the more I began to doubt my own perceptions. Was I really being ignored? Or was I just imagining it? Maybe I was overly sensitive or needy. Maybe my feelings didn't matter as much as I thought. These doubts crept into my mind slowly, chipping away at my confidence like a steady drip of water wearing down stone. I found myself second-guessing my experiences, questioning if I was reading too much into a simple glance or a missed invitation. This erosion wasn't dramatic or violent. It was subtle and persistent, a slow fading of certainty until I wasn't sure what was real anymore. What I came to understand later was that no one around me was deliberately trying to hurt me. They were caught in their own worlds, shaped by habits and expectations that had never been challenged. The authority figures in my life, the parents, the teachers, the elders, operated under the assumption that their way was the right way. These assumptions were rarely spoken aloud, but they formed an invisible framework that shaped every interaction. This is how families function, they seem to say without words. This is normal, and normalcy, once established, becomes a kind of protective shield. It keeps discomfort at bay, discourages questions that might upset the balance, and preserves the familiar, even if that familiarity is flawed. I started to see how this shield worked not just in my own family but in the wider environments I inhabited. Places that looked calm and orderly on the surface could hide dynamics that were unhealthy or painful beneath. People who seemed kind and reasonable were often blind to the ways their actions affected others. It wasn't malice. It was comfort and denial. They had no reason to look closer, to challenge the status quo, because admitting there was a problem would mean admitting they were part of it. This realization was both painful and liberating. Painful because it meant the injustice I felt was rooted in something much bigger than just my own family or my own experiences. Liberating because it gave me a new lens to understand what had happened to me. It wasn't about blaming individuals, but about recognizing the invisible forces that kept me unseen and unheard. Understanding that the silence around my feelings was not just personal neglect but part of a larger pattern helped me start to untangle the threads of my own story and imagine a different way of being. One where I could finally be seen without apology. Looking back, I realize how deeply ingrained the patterns were, how the people around me moved through their days without ever questioning the roles they played or the rules they followed. It wasn't that anyone was intentionally cruel or mean-spirited. Rather, there was a kind of collective blindness that kept everything firmly in place. The routines acted like a protective barrier, a steady rhythm that made it easier to overlook the cracks beneath the surface. When everyone wakes up at the same time, eats the same meals, exchanges the same phrases, and goes to bed with the same unspoken agreements, it becomes exhausting, and even unsettling, to imagine that something could be different. "That's just how things are," they'd say, and that simple phrase became a shield against curiosity or doubt. Authority played a huge role in this unshakable status quo. The people I lived with, the figures who directed daily life, weren't questioned because questioning them would mean unraveling the fabric of normalcy that everyone relied on. Their instructions were followed without hesitation, and their moods set the tone for the whole house. It wasn't about fear in the traditional sense, more like a learned respect for the established order, an acceptance that challenging it would only stir chaos. And so, the dynamic remained unquestioned, unchallenged, and largely invisible to those who lived within it. The authority wasn't wielded to control in a malicious way. It was simply accepted as the way things had always been, a role that no one seemed to think twice about. I began to notice, though, that this acceptance came with a cost. The quiet denial of anything unusual or uncomfortable created an environment where feelings were carefully folded away, where silence was the preferred response to anything that could upset the balance. Nobody said it out loud, but there was an unspoken agreement to maintain appearances, to look like a normal family, to act like everything was fine, even if beneath the surface there was tension, confusion, or pain. I saw how that denial protected everyone, including myself, from confronting realities that were too hard to face. It was easier to believe that the routines and rules were just part of life and to ignore the ways they sometimes felt suffocating or unfair. As I started to reflect more deeply, I realized that normal-looking environments often hide deeply unhealthy dynamics. The house where I grew up, the daily rituals, the polite conversations, even the smiles. All these things created a convincing illusion of stability. But underneath, there were currents of misunderstanding and unmet needs that no one dared to acknowledge. The normalcy wasn't a sign of health. It was a mask worn so consistently that no one remembered what lay beneath it. Recognizing this was both freeing and painful. It helped me understand why no one around me ever questioned their own behavior, not because they were blind to it, but because the comfort of routine and the fear of disruption made denial the safest choice. I wasn't alone in this. Many people live their lives wrapped in similar blankets of unquestioned habits and inherited authority, and it takes a long time, and sometimes a gentle nudge from outside, to begin peeling those layers back. I started to see how much we all wanted to believe that our world was solid and predictable, even when it wasn't. It was a way to protect ourselves from the chaos that honest reflection might bring. I had to remind myself often that this wasn't about blame or fault, but about understanding the complexity of human behavior and the ways comfort and denial can keep unhealthy patterns hidden in plain sight. Ultimately, this realization opened a pathway for me, not just to see my own story more clearly, but to imagine a different way of living, where questions could be asked without fear, where routines could be reshaped, and where authority didn't mean silence but instead invited understanding. It was a slow process, but once I started to notice the invisible forces at work, I felt less alone and more capable of creating something new beneath the same roof. There was a time when I believed that if I just spoke louder, explained more clearly, or tried harder to make my feelings and thoughts understood, things would change. I clung to that hope with everything I had. I thought that if I could only articulate my truth well enough, the walls would come down, and the silence would finally break. But after years of trying, I found myself trapped in a cycle of exhaustion and frustration. A cycle where every attempt to explain was met with dismissal, disinterest, or worse, outright denial. It wasn't just that I was tired of being unheard. It was the slow erosion of my spirit that came with each dismissal. I began to recognize how much energy I was pouring into a space that wasn't ready to hold it. I can't count the number of times I rehearsed my words in my head, carefully choosing phrases that might resonate, that might soften the blow or open a door. But those doors rarely opened. Instead, they slammed shut, sometimes silently, sometimes with a sharpness that left me reeling. After a while, the weight of those closed doors wasn't just physical. It settled deep into my bones, a quiet ache that I carried everywhere. There's an emotional shutdown that happens when you keep trying and keep being dismissed. It's subtle at first, a hesitation here, a second thought there, but over time it grows into a protective wall. I started to retreat inward, not out of defeat, but as a form of self-preservation. The idea of exposing myself again to the same dismissal felt unbearable. The fear of being misunderstood, minimized, or ignored became so intense that silence seemed like the safer choice. Not because I wanted to disappear, but because speaking up felt like stepping into a storm that I wasn't prepared to weather anymore. It's hard to explain that kind of silence to someone who hasn't experienced it. It's not just quiet. It's a retreat from vulnerability. It's a way of saying, I've tried, and I'm done trying for now. It doesn't mean the feelings have gone away. On the contrary, they simmer beneath the surface, a quiet but persistent ache. But when the cost of being heard feels higher than the cost of silence, the choice becomes clear, even if it's painful. I also feared that continuing to explain myself would only reinforce the narrative that I was the problem, that my needs or perspectives were inconvenient or irrelevant. That fear is a heavy one, because it isolates you in your own mind, making you question not just how others see you, but how you see yourself. Is my voice worth hearing? Am I asking for too much? Am I simply invisible under the same roof where I once hoped to be seen? Eventually, the emotional fatigue won. I stopped explaining, not because I gave up on the idea of connection or understanding, but because I needed space to breathe, to heal, and to figure out what it meant to be heard on my own terms. I needed to listen to myself without the background noise of dismissal, to untangle the mess of emotions that had tangled themselves around every attempt to speak. If you've ever felt that same exhaustion, like you've been trying to explain something important for years only to be met with silence or dismissal, I'd really like to hear from you. Sometimes just knowing we're not alone in this quiet retreat can make the weight a little lighter. It's okay to pause, to protect yourself, and to find new ways of being heard, even if that means starting with listening to your own voice first. If that's a place you've been, feel free to share your experience here. I'm here quietly listening too. The evening started like any other, with the soft hum of the neighborhood settling into its usual rhythm. I remember the faint glow of the street lamp outside, casting gentle shadows across the living room floor. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, its sound mingling with the distant murmur of cars passing by. I sank into the worn fabric of the couch, the familiar creak beneath me oddly comforting. My phone rested on the coffee table, screen dim but alive with occasional notifications I barely glanced at. The air smelled faintly of the dinner I just finished, garlic and roasted vegetables lingering in the kitchen, slowly fading into the background. There was nothing unusual about how I felt as the night unfolded. The quiet chatter of the housemates drifted from the hallway, casual and warm but not intrusive. I wrapped myself in a soft blanket, the kind that always seemed to carry faint traces of lavender from the laundry detergent. I sipped from a half-full mug of chamomile tea, the steam rising slowly, curling into the air like wisps of calm. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, a gentle lullaby that should have signaled rest, not unrest. I thought about the day's small frustrations, the email I hadn't sent, the missed call I intended to return, the errands left undone. But none of it felt pressing. The kind of evening where the weight of everything paused just long enough to let me breathe. I turned on the old record player in the corner, letting the crackle of vinyl fill the space with soft melodies. The music was familiar, something I'd played 100 times before, and yet it wrapped around me like a protective shield. The light from the kitchen flickered briefly, a minor glitch I barely noticed as I leaned back and closed my eyes. I listened to the distant sounds, the quiet footsteps pacing the hallway, the clink of a glass being set down. Nothing seemed out of place, nothing worth noting. Still, beneath the surface of all this ordinary, a faint undercurrent of something unspoken tugged at the edges of my awareness, like a shadow stretching just beyond the reach of the lamplight. I caught myself glancing toward the door, as if expecting someone or something I couldn't name. But when no one appeared, I shook the thought away. It was just my imagination, tired from the day's noise and the week's uncertainties. I tried to focus on the music, on the simple comfort of being here, surrounded by walls that had seen so many days like this one. The clock ticked past midnight. The house grew quieter. The voices faded into whispers, and I felt an odd mixture of peace and anticipation. Something was waiting, though I didn't know what, and I certainly didn't know then how this night would carve itself into the story of my life. It was just another night, the kind you never expect to remember, until suddenly you can't forget. I was standing near the kitchen doorway, the dim light casting long shadows across the floorboards. The rest of the house had settled into a fragile silence, the kind that feels like holding your breath underwater. From the living room, I heard murmured voices, soft, hesitant, as if the speakers believed the walls themselves had ears but no memory. I wasn't meant to hear them, I knew that right away, but something about the quiet struck a chord, pulling me closer without me even realizing. Two figures sat side by side on the worn couch, leaning in as if sharing secrets too delicate for daylight. Their words floated through the air, unguarded and raw, not sharpened by the usual masks people wear when they know they're being watched. I recognized their tones, the subtle tremor of vulnerability beneath the surface. They were speaking about me, but not in the way I had expected. There was no bitterness, no judgment, just a hesitant truth, fragile and a little lost. "I don't think he knows," one whispered, voice barely audible over the hum of the old heater. "He thinks it's all small stuff, like a game or something that will pass." The other side, a sound full of tired hope and quiet sorrow. "He carries so much more than he lets on, maybe even more than we do. Sometimes I wonder if he can see it himself, buried under the surface." I felt an unexpected swell of something, maybe empathy, maybe the sting of being understood in a way I hadn't realized I craved. They weren't talking about me as an outsider might, pointing fingers or speculating wildly. They were trying to piece together the fragments, to make sense of a person who seemed wrapped in layers of silence. "Do you think he's scared?" the first asked, voice softer now, almost respectful. "Not of what we think, but of what he might become if he lets himself feel everything." The second nodded slowly. "Yeah, fear's not just about danger. It's about change, about losing the parts of yourself that feel safe. He's balancing on a thin line, and I don't know how long he can keep it up." I stayed still, the air thick between us, as if the room itself had paused to listen. It was a kind of truth that wasn't meant to be shouted or dramatized, but to be understood quietly, like the turning of pages in an old book. I wasn't a puzzle to be solved, or a problem to fix. I was a person in between moments, fragile and uncertain. Then, as if realizing how close I was, their voices lowered even further, words tumbling out in softer tones. "We don't have to fix him. Not yet. Just be here. That's enough." And in that moment, I felt the invisible thread that tied us together, imperfect, unspoken, but real. It wasn't a grand revelation or a dramatic confession. It was something smaller, quieter, but no less irreversible. I had been seen, not in the spotlight, but in the shadows where people don't usually look. I stepped back, heart steady but changed. The night outside was still calm, the clock ticking on, but inside me, something had shifted. The words I overheard, meant to be private, had quietly settled into a new understanding, one that would linger long after the voices faded. For years, I'd carried a quiet weight, a sense that the way I saw things, felt things was somehow off, unreliable, or worse, wrong. I'd been dismissed, gently at first, as if my instincts or insights were just moments of confusion or whimsy. Sometimes it felt like people were trying to rewrite my story, to fit me into a box that didn't quite close. I questioned myself, wondering if maybe it was me, if I was too sensitive or too stubborn, too different to be trusted. But tonight, as the last words hung in the air and the room grew still, everything I'd been told I was mistaken about suddenly snapped into focus. It was as if someone had turned on a light in a room I'd been fumbling through in the dark. I realized that the things I'd sensed but couldn't quite prove, the subtle shifts in tone, the half-hidden truths beneath polite smiles, the quiet undercurrents of doubt or fear, I hadn't imagined them. They were real. The inexplicable tension I'd felt in conversations, the moments when I'd felt dismissed or misunderstood, the times I tried to speak up and was silenced or overlooked, they all had a reason. This wasn't about me being wrong. It was about me being the only one paying attention to what was really there. That realization brought a strange relief, not because it erased the past hurt, but because it reframed it. Suddenly, those moments of dismissal weren't failures on my part. but signs that I was noticing something others chose to ignore. I hadn't been wrong. I'd been ahead. The relief wasn't triumphant or loud. It was quiet, a deep breath after holding it in for so long. I wasn't wrong. I was seen, in a way I hadn't been before, not in the spotlight, but in the shadows where the truth often hides. I thought back to all the times I'd felt out of sync with the world around me, the countless little moments where my voice was pushed aside or where I was told I was too sensitive or too intense. Those moments no longer felt like personal failings. They felt like pieces of a puzzle that finally made sense. It was as if a pattern had emerged from the chaos, connecting all the dots in a way that was undeniable. I hadn't been imagining things. I hadn't been overreacting or misreading signals. I had been seeing the world clearly, just not in the way others wanted me to. This clarity changed something inside me. It didn't erase the pain or the loneliness, but it gave those experiences a new purpose. They weren't random or meaningless. They were part of a larger truth that I was only now beginning to understand. And with that understanding came a quiet strength, a knowing that my perspective mattered, even if it hadn't been acknowledged before. The night outside remained calm, unchanged by my internal shift. The clock kept ticking, indifferent to the revelations unfolding within me. But I felt different, lighter somehow. The relief wasn't about proving others wrong or seeking validation. It was about finally granting myself the permission to trust my own perceptions, to honor what I'd felt all along. That felt like freedom. For the first time in a long time, I felt seen, not in a fleeting, superficial way, but deeply in a way that mattered. Not because someone else had said so, but because I had come to believe it myself. The quiet truth I'd held on to was no longer a burden or a secret. It was a part of me, acknowledged and accepted. And that made all the difference. After that night, the air between us shifted imperceptibly, like the slow turning of a page in a book you thought you knew by heart. It wasn't marked by loud arguments or dramatic gestures, no declarations or confrontations, but by the subtle, almost imperceptible changes that settled into the spaces we once shared. Our conversations became shorter, the pauses longer, and the silences heavier, as if the words we once traded so freely had grown fragile and scarce. I found myself measuring my tone more carefully, wary of the weight my voice might carry, while they seemed to retreat behind a cool reserve, as if protecting something too delicate to expose. The house, once a sanctuary filled with laughter and easy warmth, felt quieter. The rooms echoed differently now, absorbing the distance that had quietly grown between us. I noticed the absence of small rituals, the casual touch on an arm, the shared smiles over nonsense, the easy closeness that had once been the backdrop of our days. It wasn't that we stopped caring. It was more like the way you stop noticing the hum of a familiar melody until it fades away. The connection was still there, but it was muffled, buried beneath a layer of cautious restraint neither of us dared to peel back. I caught myself hesitating before speaking, wondering if my words would be misunderstood or unwelcome. There was a new self-awareness that crept into my interactions, a guardedness that felt foreign and unwelcome but necessary. The freedom I'd found in trusting my own truth was a solitary light, illuminating my path but casting shadows on the space we shared. I realized that even without an explicit rupture, we had crossed a threshold, a quiet boundary that redefined the terms of our coexistence. Their presence became a kind of polite distance, an unspoken agreement to keep certain things unspoken. The ease that once allowed us to navigate the ups and downs of life together was replaced by a careful choreography of avoidance. I noticed the way they avoided my gaze at times, and how I, in turn, found excuses to retreat into my own thoughts, as if by doing so I could protect the fragile balance we now maintained. The weight of unvoiced truths settled between us like dust, unnoticeable at first, but impossible to ignore once you became aware of it. Even the moments that should have brought comfort, shared meals, quiet evenings, felt tinged with a strange form of solitude. We occupied the same space, yet the emotional distance made those moments feel like two parallel lines running close but never quite meeting. The silence was not empty. It was charged with all the things we no longer said. It held the space where confrontation might have happened, where questions might have been asked, but instead remained a quiet testament to what had changed. I struggled with the paradox of feeling both relief and loss. Granting myself permission to be seen in my own truth was liberating, but it also meant accepting that some part of what had been would never return. The unspoken understanding settled in my chest like a quiet ache, an acceptance that this new reality, with all its subtle distances and silences, was now the background of my life. I carried it with me, a silent companion, shaping how I moved through each day. The nights became the hardest. The darkness outside mirrored the quiet that had taken hold inside, and I often lay awake, listening to the soft sounds of the house breathing around me. I wondered if they felt the same weight, if they too noticed how the closeness we once took for granted had dissolved into a respectful distance. There was no bitterness, no anger, only a profound stillness that spoke louder than any argument ever could. In the end, what changed was not a dramatic event, but a slow unraveling of familiarity into something new and uncharted. The freedom I found came with a price, the loss of a certain ease, a shared language of closeness that we hadn't spoken about but both understood. It was a quiet consequence, one that didn't require words to be felt deeply. And though the house remained the same, the space between us had quietly widened, reshaping the contours of our lives forever. I've come to understand something profoundly simple yet often overlooked. I was never wrong. For so long, my voice was drowned out, my truths dismissed or ignored, but that doesn't mean they lacked validity. I was unheard, not mistaken. The difference is subtle but crucial. It's the difference between being wrong and being unseen, between error and silence imposed by others. Trusting myself through that silence became my quiet act of survival. That survival wasn't easy. It required patience I didn't know I had, resilience forged in the crucible of dismissal. The delayed truth I now hold is both a victory and a wound. A victory because it finally acknowledges what was always there, a wound because it took so long to be recognized. Still, the waiting didn't erase my certainty. It only sharpened it. I learned to listen to my inner voice louder than the noise of disbelief around me. That inner voice was my anchor when familiar spaces felt unfamiliar, when the language we once spoke fluently became a code I no longer understood. In those moments of quiet estrangement, I realized that self-trust isn't a given. It's a choice to believe in your own experience even when everyone else questions it. A choice to hold onto your truth even when it isolates you. And above all, a choice to keep moving forward, not because the path is clear, but because your own conviction lights the way. Emotional survival means enduring the slow unraveling of what you once thought was certain, accepting that closeness can shift and break, and still finding freedom within that transformation. I'm sharing this not just as my story, but as a reminder that many endure the same long shadows of dismissal and silence. If this resonates with you, if you've ever felt unheard or invalidated over time, know that your truth matters, even if the world hasn't recognized it yet. I invite you to share your stories in the comments below. Your voice can be a light for someone else who feels unseen. If this video spoke to your heart, please like it and subscribe for more real-life emotional stories about family, silence, and the power of late validation. We're all, in our own ways, navigating spaces where the unspoken finally demands to be heard. Together, we can turn silence into understanding.